Dee, good to get you back. I think it is a truly extraordinary time. I mean, we've been talking about this for a while now, for several years actually, and the story of the rising importance of geopolitics is becoming more and more obvious by the day. And it seems to be, I always discounted the geopolitical world as something that was in the dark and in the backgrounds and didn't always worry me and wasn't something I need to be involved in. And now it's clearly everybody's involved in everything. Geopolitics seems to be being run on Twitter right now as well. What is going on? And I know that's a difficult question, but at a top-down level, it feels that everything has changed, which is something that you identified back in the world on the brink, and you've been ongoing. But talk us through it a little bit.
Well, it's great to be back, and great to see you. It is a big question, what's going on. And I think there are a number of elements that are interacting, but I do think that we've entered a new age, and I'm calling it the age of splintering. It's an age of fragmentation. And, the age we were in before was an age of things coming together, an age of larger structures being built. And I think that we've exited that. I thought, 2 or 3 years ago that it was fragile, but I think now we're in a kind of a new age.
Yeah, because when you did the documentary for us, A World on the Brink, it was talking about the fragility of the old world order, the rules-based global order system,
That's right,
for want of a better expression. And you identified how fragile it was then, and it looks like that was right, and that fragility has led to a breaking point.
I think it has, and I think you do get these ages of the world, and things change, and the ethos, the idea, the conceptual framework changes, and I think you see it across the board. You see it in rising nationalism, populism, mercantilism, protectionism. You see it in the fear of supply chains. You see it in the fear of technologies from one place to the other, like 5G from Chinese sources. You see it in the breakdown of the kind of large-scale multilateral institutions. They're still there, but their influence seems to be less and less in a world in which sovereign nations are asserting their independence, and even groups within sovereign nations are now wanting to be independent. The Catalans, the Welsh, I mean, it's just everywhere. And so, it's a global tendency. It's not just, we don't just have Brexit or just have Orban in Hungary or just have Trump in the US or Modi in India. It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. So then the question becomes, what is causing that? Why is that it's not in one country, it's in almost every country.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, and I guess everyone has a different answer to that. And it depends on the lens that you want to look at it through. And I don't think for us really it's necessary to talk about our lenses. I think there is a broad perspective that people want change. And I think that's always the interesting point is, regardless of what it is, people are rejecting this order. So the question is how does this play out? Let's assume that is now de facto, that is happening. How does it play out? We're starting to see a splintering. How do you see this evolving? What are the next steps that we're going to be looking at in the next year or two as this whole situation evolves?
Well, I think it's a very dangerous time, and I think it's for several reasons. But what I think we need to do is to pan out, go back a little bit, and try to understand what are the fundamental driving forces of this fragmentation, this splintering. And I think there are three. And I mean, I'm sure there are more, but I think there's a coherent explanation. First is technology, which has evolved at a speed and in directions no one ever anticipated. And that has ramped up dramatically in the last 20 years. The second one is just the size of the population. I mean, it is literally at a level that humanity has never seen before. And I think that, as one dictator once said, quantity has a quality of all its own. I mean, you do have a different qualitative thing with the quantity of people. And I think the third element is our legacy human attributes, our fear of change, our nostalgia, our need for simple answers, our desire for a level of understanding that really escapes us in the complexity of things, and how those elements interact with the previous two. So you have this kind of spiral of things going around. You have technology that's changing faster than ever in making the world both incredibly more complex, but also bewildering to a lot of people. You have a level of population where you can't avoid bumping into other people. And you have these these, our Stone Age minds, where we evolved in small groups. We all knew the same people all the time. We didn't, most of the environments that we lived in were stable over long periods of time. There was abrupt change, but you would go centuries with essentially very little change. And so that's how we've evolved, and our kind of legacy attributes are not really in tune with the world we've created. And so I think that has created an enormous level of stress among people in the world. And I think that is partly or substantially underneath what we see going on.
But there's also, where this fits in, is that the abuse of power by the ruling elite is a prevalent theme that comes, and obviously the bifurcation of wealth, where very few get all of it. Is that a manifestation, or is that a thing in itself? And again, on Real Vision, you'll see there's a lot of anger about central banks and how people are dealing with our money. There's a sense that all of this is not within our control, and we're just mere pawns in that whole game, and we're the losers in that game.
Yeah.
Where does that fit into that framework?
Well, everyone's angry. You're absolutely right. And it's at a level that has not been seen within our lifetimes. And I think they feel betrayed, because I think they feel that the promises that, the social contract, as anthropologists, sociologists call it, if you do certain things, you'll be rewarded by society in a certain way. That's broken in country after country. It doesn't work anymore. And I think that people feel that they can't rely on these systems to take them into the future. But I have to back up and say there is nothing new about income disparity and wealth disparity and inequality.
No.
And there is nothing new about the elite
abuse of power.
Abuse of power. It has always been that way. But what's new, and this goes back to my emphasis on technology, what's new is, in this case, the technology of communication, of connectivity, hyperconnectivity, I sometimes call it.
Yeah.
And because what that has done is it has made things more transparent. It's made it more visible that, we now know how the wealthy live much more than we did 200 years ago. And even then, there were certainly revolutions, the French Revolution being a good example. But it is now much more obvious. And so there's that kind of awareness that I think was not as prevalent in the past. But also, there is the ability to connect to other people who share your beliefs, and to do so across time and space. And so, it used to be if you had some kind of outlandish belief, you probably would have a hard time finding anybody who shared it. Mm-hmm. Now you can find many people who do, and that reinforces this belief. So this echo chamber effect just keeps amping up. And we've been looking at this for 2 or 3, 5 years, and nothing has been done really to ameliorate it. It's just gotten worse and worse. And so you have a country like India, where, is the latest manifestation, which is WhatsApp, allows people to create mostly impenetrable networks. And, as one Indian commentator recently said, it's no longer enough to be nationalist. You've got to be ultra-nationalist. It's no longer enough to be upset at what the Pakistanis do. You've got to be outraged. I mean, everything is just amped up to this because people keep it going.
That's right. And we've seen that within social media as a whole. Of the shift in social media went from getting attention by, hey, I'm here, to, hey, I've got something interesting to say, to, hey, I need to say something more outrageous, so you read me first.
That's right.
And then I have to be more outrageous than the other person being outrageous. And you just have this nuclear arms race of outrage.
That's right.
That leads itself into the Daily Mail or whoever creating more incendious headlines all the time to get the click, to get the advertising dollar. And that seems to be writ large globally, and it's the same in politics we've seen.
It's infected politics. It has driven politics to the edges. So you have this centrifugal force that's driving everything to the edges. And there's very little center. And the center can't be heard because it's not outrageous. And the algorithms are designed to do this. So you've got this model that the social media companies have developed, where they have essentially an almost addictive, it has been called addictive by psychologists, an addictive structure, inbuilt structure of reward.
That's right.
And you then have the mining of information on individuals based on this constant flow of data that the social media companies use to essentially that's their business model. They use that to sell advertising.
That's right.
And to sell information on people, to sell advertising and so forth. And then you have the result of that, which is these algorithms that get more and more refined to focus on the more and more outrageous things. So it's a kind of a spiral.
And the advent of big data has allowed for behavioral economics, which we talked about before. Yeah. The rise of behavioral economics has manifested itself primarily on Facebook first, and it's happening all across social media, is when you've got big data and human emotion all put in the same place, you can affect emotion.
That's right.
So, whether it's affected election outcomes or whether it's just in selling product. At Real Vision, we lived this. So we decided at one point, with the help of Google, to start trying to advertise Real Vision within social media. And our competition there had been, in the financial world, had people like Agora, who's the publishing business. Now, Agora sold on very sensationalist headlines. So many people will be familiar with the James Altucher Bitcoin one, and it's all about you can either make a fortune or it's the end of the world and you need to read this to save yourself. And what it does is it's appealing to raw human emotion. If you amplify that in social media, what you get is very good results. So these guys have had huge ROIs out of that because it's emotion on top of emotion. You're using technology and big data to push those buttons endlessly. So Real Vision came into the equation, and we don't have that content. Our modus operandi is to be the central ground, to allow everybody from all sides to be able to come, whether we have Nigel Farage on one side and Steve Bannon, populists, to people who are centrists and people on the left. We don't care. We'd like a nice, even platform of people's opinions that we can all learn from. To say we are the middle ground and we're the open platform, we don't have a voice, doesn't work in advertising. Because the center ground in this world doesn't work, and it literally doesn't work in quantifiable ROI on ad dollars, doesn't work, because we can't compete with somebody saying, look at me, the world's all screwed, you need to read my newsletter, or I'm going to make you $1 million tomorrow, buy my newsletter. We don't work.
It's exactly right, and I think that there's an interesting thing going on with this, which is that as the world has been driven into this kind of centrifugal thing where you want things on the edges, you want things that are outrageous, you want things that are demonstrably not sane, really. It has fed into something that these two things have dovetailed. That's one. The other one is this feeling that the system is not working anymore.
Yeah.
And so, and demonstrably it isn't working. And this is another very interesting topic that I would like to talk about. But the feeling that it isn't is scary. And it's scary for everybody. It's scary if you're at the top. It's scary, maybe scarier if you're at the bottom, but it's scary all the way through. And so that ability to channel that fear into anger and outrage feels good. Back to the behavioral economics. It feels like you're doing something.
That's right.
And so that itself, this has arrived at a moment, and maybe it's a causal factor of the moment, but it's also at a time in which these emotions are running high anyway, and so it's just amped them up considerably.
So where does that lead to? I mean, does this keep going until what? What do you break at this point? The Catalans separate from Spain, and the Brits separate from Europe, and the US separates from the rules-based global order system. Where's this going? I mean, what is the outcome here? Is the outcome war?
Well, if you go to any good military college, they will tell you that nationalism is always a prelude to war. And that is a standard analytical structure. And you do have these things like the potential Thucydides trap between China and the U.S. And that's a very serious issue. The Thucydides was an ancient Greek historian, and he posited that anytime you have a plateaued power, an incumbent power, and you have a rising power that is challenging it, it very often leads to war. So in his case, it was Sparta was the incumbent power and Athens was the rising power, and it did lead to war. And so this is called the Thucydides trap. And, somebody recently studied this. There have been 16 cases.
Richard Allen said, we had him on Real Vision.
Oh, did you? Okay, yeah. There have been 16 cases of Thucydides type situations in the last 500 years. 12 have led to war. So it is a thing. It is so it may lead to war. It doesn't necessarily need to lead to war. The rise of the Soviet Union in the 20th century did not in the end lead to war.
But the problem is here we've got not only the rise of different powers, so arguably it's the rise of China, and then with others in the wings, probably Russia, Iran, Turkey. There's a whole shift going on, which we'll talk about in a bit. But there's also this domestic core rotting in each country where it feels like it's collapsing in on itself anyway. So when you've got both things, it feels like, well, I don't know what the outcome is.
It's really problematic. And you're right, and it does, and I think there are, I think we're reaching the end of a certain, you and I have talked about this before, we're reaching the end of a certain set of trends in history. Some people call it neoliberal economics, where you felt like the opportunities were endless and that there was always a way to manipulate the economic situation to provide for more growth. And of course, one of the things that really, I think, distresses me and a lot of people is that what we've done to do that is debt. And debt is borrowing from the future to pay for the present. So now you have this enormous debt overhang, public and private. And we may be seeing the beginnings of coming to the end of that. But there's something else going on. And it's hard to put your finger on it. But the thing that I think is both interesting and concerning about this is that in looking for answers, we're saying, well, what we have doesn't work, which is the one statement I found that you can say to anyone in any political group that they will agree with. I mean, you can go to any dinner, any party, and you say what we have is it's not working, and everybody will agree. But why are we looking for solutions in old systems? I mean, you have people looking at socialism and communism, the 150-year-old system devised for, which arguably never worked anyway, and that's what the 20th century was. It was an experiment in that, and it did not actually work. But it was devised for a set of problems that are entirely different from what we have. And every other system we're looking at is even older. Maybe we need to break the mold. Maybe we need to look at something new that can give us, and I don't have that answer, but I do think it's distressing that so many people, including young people in the US and Europe, are looking backwards at these old solutions, which I just don't think I think they're inapposite. I think they're not going to work in the current problem set that we have.
And I think much in the same way that technology has created some of the problems, it will create some of the potential. I think we've talked about this, and the things that are happening, for example, in blockchain and cryptocurrency and cryptography and closed systems and the ability to protect your own data, all of this stuff feels like it's all part of a larger potential outcome. Privacy is a huge issue for people these days.
Absolutely.
And China's gone the complete extreme where there is no privacy for anybody, and it's a Big Brother-style world. Now, knowing how the West works, yes, the governments may want to try that, but the private sector will try its hardest to give us our privacy back. And I think, even some of the technology we know, Facebook and stuff, Google, will get broken up in this process as I've been talking about for some time. But I feel that technology is going to be part of the solution as well as part of the problem.
I agree with you, and I think it has to be. But if you look at the Chinese, for example, what you have there is their greatest fear is the fear of social disorder.
Yeah. And
so, it makes sense for them with that mindset, and that's a traditional Chinese mindset, but buttressed by the introduction of communism and social control and so forth. But then, it makes sense for them to put these things in place that they feel they can use to control it. But underneath that is the situation that China cannot feed itself, and China cannot provide for its own energy. And so, they see those as sovereign threats. They see them as threats to their sovereignty. And it's very difficult for them to address. And this, I think, is what's behind the One Belt, One Road initiative, is that they have no choice, given the size of their population, given their demographic crisis, which is that they're moving into a world where there will be one working person supporting two retired parents and possibly 4 retired grandparents, because demographic, age, lifespan has extended so much. Given those issues, they are really between a rock and a hard place in terms of food and energy. And so, then you put in a threat like what's been going on for the last few months with the African swine virus that a lot of people don't even know about, but it's decimated the pig farming, and that's $1 trillion industry in China. And nobody knows what the outcome. It's highly contagious. It's now spreading around Asia, and they had culled 1 million pigs by January, and it's still a growing problem. And so the problem when you get to these situations where you've got everything spread so thin is that one thing, orthogonal, torpedo from the side can create a huge issue.
My view on this is the more they try and suppress the volatility of the population to avoid the outcome that they fear, which is a volatile population. I always said that suppressed volatility always leads to hypervolatility in the end. Mm-hmm. We've seen every revolution has been essentially that. Yeah. If you have a free society, you don't have revolutions because you don't need one. Yeah. So the thing is the more you suppress the natural order of volatility of a population, people need the right to vent themselves and do all of these things. If you stop that, you create it, and then anything can be kindling, whether it's a food crisis, whatever it may be, and before you know it, everything has changed.
That's exactly right. You increase the brittleness of society.
Exactly.
And you do. It is actually paradoxical because people think by increasing control they're increasing stability, and they're not actually. They're creating a brittle system that can break with a blow that would not have broken it before. Yeah. And so you do have these situations that it's interesting because, for all its flaws, as has been often said, democracy works because it allows you to voice that skepticism. You can say, throw the bums out. And that, in fact, the U.S. has now done that twice. I think it's very interesting that what's happened, a lot of people who voted for Obama then turned around and voted for Trump because they were both seen to be outside the system. Yeah. And so, what now I'm concerned about social stability in the U.S., too, very concerned. But the Western democracies do have that relief valve where people can express their anger or their fear, and they can even do it by changing the government. And that's not true in an autocratic state. And therefore, they are more brittle.
So we've got a world now that China, as you rightly pointed out, has to expand its sovereign territory in order to maintain its sovereignty.
It has to expand. At least it has to expand the resource capital that it owns and it can draw upon. And so you see this, and now Belt and Road, which was supposed to be about Asia. I mean, there are countries in Latin America signing up for it. There's Italy is signing. I mean, you have it. It has become a global system, and and it is exactly what you said. It is securing those resources so that they don't face the sovereign threats that they will if resources are cut off. And what I'm saying is that that is already beginning to run into roadblocks because people are finding out what it's like to have the Chinese lend you billions of dollars for a port, and then you can't pay it, and they say, okay, well then we'll take the port. And this has happened.
And the problem is the Chinese actually don't have much money either. So as we know, they have a global they have a shortage of dollars. The RMB is not a global reserve currency. Clearly, by trying to build One Belt, One Road, they're trying to get more people into their own financial system. But as a share of the global economy, the RMB, I think, is even falling in global share these days. So they've got a problem is they can't finance their grand ambition. So I don't know what happens, and that worries me as well, when they have a desperate need to not upset the population. They have a need for resources to continue what they're doing, yet they don't have the wherewithal to pay for it, potentially. That in itself has a lot of fragility built into it.
They have, and you're right, and it's not just the Belt and Road, it's the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and all these. They've been trying to, turn the world towards themselves with very limited success because people are beginning to understand what that means, and so they're very skeptical about it. And yes, you're right, and this is, again, I hate to say, here's another indicator pointing towards war, but what's the last resort when a country begins to fall apart? It's often a military adventure. Now, there's some things going on in China that mitigate against that, and one of the biggest ones is the one-child policy, because so many people, and that's changed now, but it'll be decades before you see the effect of that. But so many people have one child, and they don't want that one child who's going to support them in their old age to be killed in a war. So there's an oil on the water effect, I think, to some extent of that. But the problem is when you get an autocratic regime feeling really threatened, it's an easy thing to do to whip up support among the population. Putin found that in Ukraine,
So how do the Russians figure into this global situation now? To me, they've been the antagonizers. They've kind of done everything necessary. I think they perceive the fragility of the global system right now, and they've always been on the outside of it, antagonizing it, and it feels like they can feel the house of cards swaying, and they're pushing at every angle.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think they're the spoiler, they're the gadfly in international relations. And there's a reason for that. There are two or three reasons. One is that Russia has always felt threatened from every direction. And in fact, that's true. They always have been threatened from east and west, and that goes back centuries. So that's a cultural mindset. And that's never going to change in our lifetimes, maybe ever. But also, their biggest fear right now is the American political class, or the American government that goes across many administrations, the American predilection for regime change. And they see that this has happened in, Iraq, it's happened in Libya, it's happened in Syria, tried to do it in Syria, and they're, now talk about it in Iran. And they are afraid that they'll be the subject of that in the future. And so one of their approaches to try to mitigate that threat of American regime change turning on Russia is to sow discord within the U.S., which they've done very successfully for pennies on the dollar with the social media campaigns and all these things that we're talking about.
On all sides of the political equation.
On all sides.
Yeah.
No, they try to whip up both sides, all sides. They have and they support the anti-vaxxer, It's just whatever they can do that stirs dissension, that's what they do. But they also do it between the U.S. and its allies. There's some islands in off the coast of Japan, between Japan and Russia, that Russia seized at the end of World War II, and that Japan has always claimed. And the Russians have now started talks to give those back to Japan. And again, it's clearly to try to break the steadfast relationship between Japan and the U.S. They want to do whatever they can to weaken the U.S. because they're afraid that a strong U.S. eventually will turn on them and say, we need regime change in Russia. And so, and that whole model, they're very clever in how they use resources because they don't have a lot. So, the Syrian intervention, there have never been more than 25 airframes. There are 25
They have
planes.
a lot of resources, meaning natural resources, but not...
Right, yeah. But they've got a declining population, and they do have, they're very good at technology. But they're very good at pennies on the dollar kind of things, So they make this big intervention, make all this noise in Syria, but it's tiny. It's 25 planes. Never been more than that. They've rotated them in and out, but yet they've created this huge effect with it. So they're very smart about how they use resources. And there's a story, and I think it's apocryphal, but because I think the reasons it wouldn't actually be true, but it kind of captures this, is that the U.S. when they started the International Space Station supposedly spent more than $1 billion, more than $1 million on a pen that would write in space, and the Russians brought a pencil. Now, that's probably not true because pencil leads can break off in space, but it captures the idea of what the Russians do it cheaply and they do it with effect, whereas the U.S. does overkill,
The grandiose statement.
Exactly, yeah. So
looking at that region as well, is how does the rest of Asia play out within China, which is now, as we know, trying to be the central focus point of the region. We talk about splintering Asia in some respects. Where does that all fit in? And then how does India fit into that whole part as well?
Well, India is a very interesting place right now, and there's a lot going on. India is going to surpass China in terms of population in the near future. India has a culture that is really, in many ways, more relevant to the West or more related to the West because of its history. Not just that that it speaks English. That's only about 10% of the Indian population, but nevertheless, it has a lot of things that make it very interesting from a business standpoint, and very interesting from the standpoint of what it can do in Asia. Now, right now, like the rest of the world, it is experiencing some kind of hyper nationalization tendencies. Those are being whipped up, and those are problematic, particularly with its relationship to the powers to its west, Pakistan and so forth. But I think that there's a lot going on in technology in India. There's an entrepreneurial spirit there. There's an experimental spirit there. The rise of frugal technology, not to be confused with jugaad, which is workaround technology, but really people inventing things like a baby monitor that can be sold for $3 and then frees up women to work. And those have implications here in the West too, because I would rather pay $3 or $5 for a baby monitor than $30. It just does the same thing.
That's right.
But there's some other examples of that, that are really interesting in India. India also, and spreading out now to the east, into Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is benefiting from the U.S.-China trade war because it's seen as outside that polarity. And so manufacturing is moving to those countries. In many cases, labor is cheaper. And they're seen now as, paradoxically, as more stable than China, at least in the context of the China-U.S. thing. So I'm actually pretty bullish on Southeast Asia and on India with some reservations. And I think that, that they're actually in a position, albeit there are issues going on. There's radical Islam. There are all these different things that are happening there like everywhere else. But nevertheless, there's some things going on, I think, that are actually positive.
As China and America split apart, which is what they seem to be forcing themselves away from each other to have some sort of distance. How big that distance will end up being, we don't know yet. You're seeing it that ends up being a great opportunity for everywhere else. As supply chains break and people don't know the strength of the relationship between China and America now, they're deciding, okay, well, let's go to Vietnam, let's go to India, let's go to somewhere else.
Right. Finding inefficiencies and unexploited inefficiencies and just change itself is something that has huge economic opportunity. And I think people are afraid of change, but I think that they should rethink that, at least in terms of investable opportunity. This is the kind of thing that we track a lot at my company, Strategic Insight Group, and we look at these dichotomies, these changes, these unexplored or unexploited or underexploited inefficiencies. Those are things that can really have huge opportunity, and so you're seeing that now in Asia because you're seeing this breakup of the U.S. and China. You're seeing resistance to Chinese overlordism, if you want to call it that, in Southeast Asia, Malaysia being a good example of that. And so, there are opportunities now in the rest of Asia, sort of from India all the way down through Southeast Asia, that I think are really interesting.
So if you're looking at a 20-year view, let's assume that this splitting apart of China and America continues. By your framework, it makes it clear to me, regardless of the downsides of India, it is really India's opportunity to waste here. I mean, they get all the opportunity because you've got a big, stable country with rule of law and all of the bits and pieces and a democracy. So if you look at FDI development from global powers, India's got to be a more interesting place. Yeah, there's a bunch of bureaucracy that needs sorting out. There's a whole load of things. India's not perfect, but it just feels that the world will shift away from what both America and China think it's going to shift to, and it shifts to somewhere else.
Yeah, it's India's to lose.
Yes.
It is. I agree with you. And you know, the flying ointment of all these things is the specter of war. So, you know, as long as the split of Chimerica and the Chinese, you know, American dissolution is not accompanied by physical violence or cyber war, which is a huge concern.
Yeah.
You know, as long as that kind of thing doesn't happen, then yes, I think you're right. It becomes an opportunity in the rest of Asia. And I think that as long as India doesn't, you know, get into a war with Pakistan or two nuclear-armed powers there, you know, then again, you do have instabilities, you do have problems, but you've got enormous opportunity there. So I think, you know, you can project forward 20 years that India becomes the kind of pinnacle, the guiding light of Asia, not China, because China will have so many problems, and their gaze is going to be turned more and more internally as their problems, you know, become increasingly onerous.
And they can't pay for the ability to look externally, I guess.
Yeah.
So the other big thing that is going on in the world, because there's a lot geopolitically going on, it's the nexus of Turkey, Saudi, Iran.
You know,
How is this all playing out, and what is the end game here, and what is going on? Because obviously the House of Saud has now become expansionist in its philosophies, and it is clearly now threatening Iran. It's trying to get the West to distance itself from Iran. Iran obviously has supporters in Russia and China as well, and India. Iran has always been the epicenter of the world stage. Turkey has been, and now Saudi is, I guess, a relative newcomer to that equation. How is this going to play out? Because this worries me. If there's a war coming, it's somewhere between these three.
it's very worrisome. And the Middle East is an intractable set of problems. And it's so complex because you have all these different dynamics going on. You've got the Sunni Shia one, and you've got the fundamentalist, traditionalist one. But you've also got a lot of others. You've got Turkey and the rest of the Arab world, and that is an animosity that goes back to the Ottoman Empire.
Yep.
You've got Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is part of the Sunni Shia thing, but it's also different from that, or it adds on to that. You've got the U.S. and foreign powers who, you know, have been causing problems in the Middle East since at least the Sykes-Picot Agreement at the end of World War I that split up the whole region into these artificial countries that cut across the cultural units so that they could be easier to control. And so, you know, and those borders are now the borders we have, and they've you know, changed a bit over the last 20 and 30 years as wars have happened, but pretty much fixed. And they don't function. They're not functional for the purposes of you know, what the Middle East should be, given its history. So you've got this huge, complex situation of roiling and highly emotional conflicts that have huge histories, huge long tails, and it's an almost intractable set of problems. So, you know, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, the temperature has been hiked up over the last few years. The U.S., you know, now has an idea in the current administration that goes back to, you know, the problems with Iran in the 70s, that the U.S. wants to see regime change there, depending on who you talk to. Depending on who you talk to, it is or it isn't looking to, you know, deploy a huge number of troops. So we're back to kind of the situation of before the Iraq War in some ways.
Iran is such a bigger, more
such
powerful
a huge
country.
It's the regional hegemon in
That's
that area.
right.
And it would not work to try to take it on. And that's been the conclusion of every thoughtful analysis of foreign policy in the last, you know, 40 years, is that, you know, Iran is just such a large power, and it has so much developed capability that, you know, you can't take it on by force. Now, Saudi Arabia is much smaller in terms of population. It has more money. It has more access. There's now this Saudi Arabian-Israeli friendship that's happening.
That's right.
That, enemy of an enemy is a friend kind of thing. And although I think it's more complicated than that. And you've got the Saudi adventurism in Yemen, which is a proxy war with the Iranians. And so it's highly, highly inflammable. The only thing I think that might contain it is I think that everybody realizes that it's a balance of power situation and everybody's going to be hurt badly by a war. And they don't really know what the U.S. is going to do in that case.
My fear is, I don't know, for some reason I just feel like the Saudis want to do this. The Iranians haven't basically invaded anybody in,
No.
I don't know whether it's centuries, but certainly, certainly longer than my entire lifetime.
It's not like the Persians of the Greek days.
No. So the aggressor is going, yes, they are playing on the political playing field. They're doing things that they shouldn't be doing in a whole bunch of other countries. Feels that Saudi's going to start that fight. If they go to war, that's a proxy war for the whole world. I mean, there's a world war in the making in the middle of that because everybody has skin in that game somewhere.
Everybody does. It's interesting that the U.S. has less skin in the Middle East than it used to because of the development of hydraulic fracking.
Yeah.
And that has changed the balance.
But that's unsettled the Middle East, right? Because the U.S.
Exactly.
basically pulled out.
Exactly. But this is another one of these technological feedback loops where nobody saw that coming. And suddenly the U.S. has, arguably the largest supply of oil in the world, and we can dial it up and dial it down. And so the importance, the urgency of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East, driven primarily by the need for the oil, is dialed down. And this, feeds into a narrative that's been going on in the U.S. for at least 3 administrations, since the end of the Bush administration, which is we need to pull back. We can't be policemen of the world anymore. And you do have, in every administration, you have the yin and yang of that. You have the desire to go out and do things, but also the desire to pull back. But I think the population as a whole feels exhausted. And I think that that people don't want the U.S. to be and have these military adventures anymore. And so, you can see that thread going consistently from late Bush 2 through Obama through Trump. And yes, there are things that mitigate against that, but on the whole, but the fracking thing then added to, okay, well now the reason's gone that we should be. I mean, we're friends with the Israelis and we're friends with the Saudis supposedly, and but the urgency of it is no longer there because we don't really need the oil. Yeah. Our allies need the oil, but then the U.S. is in the process of not, being as interested in allies as it was, at least under the current administration.
Yeah, that's right.
So.
And then moving across the world, we get to Europe, which is, I don't even know where Europe's problem. This is an extraordinary situation. We're talking around the world in a way that I've never seen before because there were certain structures in place that meant there was some global cohesion. And that cohesion seems to be falling apart. And Europe is one of the areas that is literally falling apart in front of our eyes. It hasn't got to the worst stage, but Britain is the first stage of that, I think. Yeah. But it can't even leave the EU and it can't stay.
Yeah.
It's in this mess. And I don't know what's going to happen, how Germany's going to play out once Angela Merkel's out and all of this, whether it can hold together through a recession or not.
The EU is the poster child for this age of splintering that I'm talking about,
yes.
Really. And as you say, it's so complex. Germany, the rise of Germany in the late 20s, since the 1990s, has been another one of these Thucydides trap things that has not led to war. It's cited as such, and but you have huge imbalances in Europe. You have huge dissension in countries like France and Italy, and then you have Brexit, and you have the potential of all these breakaway parts of it, because I think if Brexit happens, it's not unlikely that then Scotland and Wales will break apart, and you'll have, it'll go from Great Britain to Little England.
So Europe, I'm not really so worried about the splintering. Yes, getting there is painful. This UK may have to go through decades of issue, but in the end, small, agile economies may work well. Europe used to be that. It was only in the last 100 years that it all clumped together.
Yeah.
And so maybe small agile economies is the way forward that we need, so you can account for all of these tribal differences that we all have. And therefore, even wars don't become so cataclysmic because you have smaller people fighting with each other.
This is a whole very interesting...
Builds more anti-fragility.
Yeah. And so, it's... So you do have, indeed, a situation in the last century where Europe was very fragmented, and then it clumped together into what were seen as culturally coherent units, Italy, Germany, and then they all went to war, and they did that twice. And so the goal of the European Union was to avoid that happening again. And so it was a project of the last century, of the middle of the last century, really, and it just kept developing. And it closer and closer integration, it became the mantra, and it was something that, was, again, it's part of this 20th century concept that things need to be pulled together, they need to be larger, that's the world that we're in. And I think there was the psychology of the Soviet...
because we had the Soviet Union, we had Europe, Pax Americana. I mean, all of those things are all clumped together.
That's right. And now, we're simply seeing the reversal of that. But, to your point about smaller units, I mean, there are people who are saying, that the city is the model of the future, because cities are human in scale. Even if they're huge, they're still easier to understand. They have their own culture. I live in Texas, and every city, you've got Houston, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, El Paso. They all have their own culture, and they're very different from one another. And if you don't like one, you can go down the road to another one. And they run in a different way. They have different, ideas. They connect to different parts of the world. And so, the idea that we need to break into smaller political units is something that some people are talking about.
That's interesting, because if you look at I would argue the most successful economies of the last 30, 40 years have been city-states.
Yeah, Singapore,
Abu Dhabi, Dubai.
Exactly.
I mean, these are all basically one-horse towns.
That's right.
That have done extremely well on the world stage. Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Amazing. So,
and the question is, can that be replicated? Can you have a world like that? Do
you have to have it in actual construct, or can you have it in cyber construct?
That's a good question.
Because if we're talking about abandoning what we know about the world and moving forwards, maybe within cyber construct you could have city-states, essentially. And we've seen this even with the advent of cryptocurrency, is anybody can have their currency now.
Yeah.
And you don't have to have a central bank. And there's a whole bunch of, the world has changed. I don't think we've figured out what the world is yet, but almost anything is doable.
That's right. And this is now we're getting into what I'm interested in the sense of not looking to old models.
That's right.
But looking to new models. And they're over the horizon. We can't see, I love that saying with Michelangelo that he never carved a statue, he just chipped away at the marble till he got to the statue. We haven't chipped away enough marble yet to actually, but we know there's a statue in there. But we're not going to get to it if we just fall back on old models. And so I think this kind of thinking is what needs to happen. And now city-states are an old model, but they're a very old model, not something that
yes, or, forget the city-state and say, okay, let's accept everybody's different, and people want to hang around with their own group of people. Well, why can't we've used this in discussions before, but it's easy. The Rottweiler lovers, they can have their own currency, and they can speak to each other in their own platform. They can have their own language. They develop over time. And the Chihuahua lovers, they've got their own currency,
right?
And they can trade with each other. There's no reason we have to use borders as constructed now, as opposed to psychological borders where social media has created this now anyway.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, and this is really out there radical thinking, because people will say, no, you simply can't just ditch all these things that are existing incumbent structures. But I think the world has often done that. I mean,
of course it has. Religion was ditched as a ruling structure.
Yeah. And so you do have that kind of thing going on, and I think that this age of splintering, as I like to call it, is one of the key things is the connectivity revolution, and I would say beyond social media, but that's a big part of it.
Yes.
Is of creating these on the one hand bad echo chambers that make exacerbate hyper partisan things, but on the other hand you can get all the enophiles together, you can get all the butterfly collectors or whatever they all are.
That's right.
And they have these commonalities and they're communities, so it's really virtual communities that you're
That's
talking
right.
about.
That's right.
But this is where Now, where are the opportunities in that? Because they're huge ones.
Completely.
Huge ones. But we're not thinking that way. And I think that a lot of people who are in charge of, investing money or who are in charge of political development or who want to be, they're not thinking that way. They're thinking within the existing structures. And it does not have to be a violent change, and we're speculating here, obviously. Right. But you can see that these things could evolve. There is a pathway where things can evolve, and it can be positive. There's huge other problems we haven't talked about. Climate change being the elephant in the room. But those are going to have to be dealt with. And so, how do we best deal with them? Is it these large incumbent structures, or is it something new? Is there some other statue there in the marble that we need to carve out?
And I think, if I'm trying to tease apart themes that are happening, there is fragmentation, there's disintermediation, there's the devolution of power into certain things. So if the world was doing this, it's now doing that in every way, shape, or form. So I think the answer is going to be in all of those things. That fragmentation may look like the most terrifying thing, but maybe all the answers lie within that. And as you said, I think both you and I are very keen to not look at this and say, well, the world's fucked. It's to actually look at this and say, the world is changing, there's going to be opportunity.
Yeah.
And, where the best place to apply our intelligence is look at where that opportunity lies, because those opportunities are enormous.
They are absolutely enormous. The problem for ourselves and our children, and hopefully not our grandchildren or great-grandchildren, but is that we are in one of these transitional periods now, and those things are very difficult to deal with. The wars of Europe, the religious wars of Europe are a good example of that. 130 plus years of conflict that ended up killing 30% of the European population. And that was with early modern weapons, not postmodern weapons. But because people fear change and they hold on to, they have nostalgia often for things that never existed in the first place. But they want it, they don't want it to change. They're afraid they're going to lose what they have. They're afraid of the implications of it. And so you have a large set out of any population that wants to hold on. And they're the ones, even when the forces of change, the structural forces of change are so enormous that they in the end can't be resisted, you're going to have a huge psychological problem on the part of large groups who now can interconnect and act together in doing this. So I think that, you've got state A, which is where we were and are just leaving, and you've got, let's say, state C, which is this thing we're talking about, whatever it is. In between that, you've got state B, which is going to be chaotic, incredibly difficult, and dangerous and hard to navigate. And that's what we're entering. But it doesn't mean there's not a lot of opportunity there. There's a huge amount of opportunity there, maybe more than there was in the past, but it's going to be much less predictable, and it's going to be much more dynamic, and that can be good or bad. But you're going to have things that are going to come up and challenge. I mean, the rise of the migration crisis. It's a good example. We haven't talked about that, but and I would now turn the conversation to Latin America.
I was just about to ask you about Venezuela and Latin America as a whole.
So Latin America is an interesting region right now. I remember sitting here in New York in a foreign policy meeting about 5 years ago, and the subject of Latin America came around, and somebody said, well, the thing about Latin America is there are no geopolitics in Latin America. And everybody agreed. And how the world has changed. I mean, Latin America is awash in geopolitics right now. And, there are countries that have done very well and seem to have solidified their progress, Chile being a good example. There are countries that have done well but are faltering now, Colombia and Mexico are being an example. I would put Brazil into that category. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, there are countries where they're really either in or plunging into crisis. Venezuela being the poster child for that. But look at Nicaragua, which is almost in the same situation Venezuela is, and it's gotten there much faster. And the problem with all these states, and we know this from the Middle East, failed states infect the states around them.
Yeah.
And people thought, well, that's not going to happen in Latin America, and that's not. It's absolutely not correct. It is happening in Latin America. I mean, there are more than 1.5 million refugees from Colombia, and they are from Venezuela, and a large number of them go into Colombia, and they are destabilizing a lot of the progress that Colombia has made.
Because they come with no rules from society, because they've walked out of society, you bring a massive influx of crime generally. And this is what leads, whether it's the cartels and everything else, it comes from that kind of weak government.
It's not just crime. Because sometimes that is there, and surprisingly, sometimes it's not as much as you would think. But it's also the resentment that it builds in a population in the area into which the migrants are coming. Now, Colombia is such an interesting case in this sense, because a lot of the migrants coming from Venezuela into Colombia were actually Colombian a generation or two ago when they left Colombia because Venezuela was more stable. And so they're ethnically Colombian, but they come back in, and you have all the same problems that you have in Europe and other places, is that these people aren't paying taxes and they're getting benefits, and we're not getting them, and we are paying taxes. And so there's the resentment, even though they're the same people. So there's something going on with migration that's not just cultural. There's something else going on. And I think it's really interesting. It's troubling, but it's very interesting how this is playing out in Colombia. But that is beginning to affect all the countries around it in the Venezuela situation. Nicaragua is also beginning to infect all the countries around it. And if you had a similar number of people exiting Nicaragua, and depending on how things go, you could be looking at 500,000 refugees, 500,000 migrants.
And where they go, Costa Rica, which is the stable place, and then they're going to get it all.
And it's starting to happen there, and you are starting to have, but they'll also go north. And in the current climate, can you imagine what 200,000 or 300,000 people arriving at the Mexican border of the U.S. would do? I mean, then you really do have a real crisis. And then you've got the so-called Northern Triangle. So Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador that are having huge issues already, leaving aside Nicaragua. I mean, the part of this is related to climate change, because there's a dry zone and the coffee crop is being dramatically affected. I've been in Guatemala twice in the last 6 months, and it is a place that is under huge stress. And then the rise of of gang activity in general. Bad governance, which has always been there. And so, you do find that while the number of people trying to migrate to the U.S. from Mexico is way down, it's at net zero, really. Maybe just coming above that, but the number of people who are coming through Mexico from Central America into the U.S. has risen enormously. And this is as a result of these crises. So, as situations destabilize, you're going to have these migrant crises all over the world. And that feeds into this fear of change and the groupism, whatever you want to call it.
Because I'm a product of mass migration. So my father moved to England in the early 60s. England imported enormous numbers of people from India and from Jamaica.
Right.
It took until I got to about 30 years old before almost all of those, for the Indian population to be mainly digested. The West Indian population, probably they still had riots and still had issues going on for maybe another 10 years after that. And then finally they've been integrated because then the Eastern Europeans turned up. Right. And then they had to be integrated, so then it unified everybody else, and it's like the new people have come in. So I've gone through it, and it takes a generation pretty much to integrate a large wave of people. And the world has seen a huge amount of this. And it takes time, but repeated movements of people on top. So the problem is Europe faced the Eastern European. First they got the war countries, Albania, Croatia, etc., the ex-Yugoslavian countries. That happened. Then there was the new member states of Europe. So that happened. So the Poles and et cetera came in. And then there was the Arab Spring and then the Syrian situation.
Mm-hmm.
So we had basically 4 waves of immigration in a record short period of time.
Yeah.
And no wonder it's difficult to absorb. It's going to take time.
And that may be the tip of the iceberg. And this is the problem when you're looking at a world with another 100 million or 200 million or 300 million migrants, forced migrants in some cases, sometimes internal migrants within countries, but sometimes immigrants, people going from one country to another. I mean, it is an enormously destabilizing situation.
And we may get climate migrants as well.
And we already are getting climate migrants. I mean, this really is what Central America is the first example of that. And whatever you want to believe about climate change or its causes, it nevertheless, the climate there has changed. It's much drier, and the coffee can't. And that is, an area where coffee is a very important crop. It's happening in Chiapas too. There's about 70% lower coffee crop. And Chiapas is the southern state of Mexico. Used to be part of Guatemala. It borders on Guatemala. So the pressures are happening even within Mexico. And as this gets amped up, and I'm really concerned for how the world is going to deal with it, because as the Colombian thing shows, they can be the same people. And they come in and they're not, they seem to be from another place and they're not paying taxes. And it still creates just as much of a...
And so does that not force the US to play a larger role in its region? Because it has been incredibly hands-off since the early 80s.
Yeah.
It's basically not done anything in the region, not been involved. They had a little bit with Noriega and a couple of bits and pieces here, and that's it. They've been completely uninvolved, disengaged from the region. Why do they not get more involved in their own region, stabilize it, take advantage of the Venezuela situation? There's enormous amounts of natural resources there as well, and then create a Western Hemisphere strengthened alliance.
There are two opposing threads going through that, and they're often in the same person if you talk to people in Latin America. And one is the resentment of the U.S. as the hegemon,
sure.
and the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said that is our backyard and we need to control it and so forth. And then on the other hand, there are people in Latin America, and I've spoken with them, in positions of high influence, who think the U.S. should intervene militarily in Venezuela. So you get these two opposing things, and literally sometimes you have the same person saying this two different things, which is not unusual these days for somebody to say. I mean, I'm sure you hear it all the time on Real Vision. But starting with the Carter administration, and as a reaction to the Iran-Contra deal, all those things that went on, that was actually after Carter, but starting with the Carter administration, there was a feeling of the desire to pull back from a direct involvement in Latin America, and that has been, it's been turned up and down a bit over time, and the Reagan administration turned it up, some because of the feeling of a threat from the Soviet Union. But generally speaking, I think the attention was directed elsewhere. Asia was becoming the area that was, that had the most promise, and the Middle East was becoming the area that had the most problems, and we were dependent on the oil from there. And so it became an area where people didn't pay much attention. And I think that Latin America got used to that. And so it was out of sight, out of mind. And I think that's changing. And I think that there is a case for saying, let's make the Western Hemisphere really strong and really, coherent as a whole. And there's a lot to be said for that. Those are all Western cultures in a sense as much as the U.S. is. They're a Western European culture overlaid on top of a native Indian culture, which is often almost not there, but it's still where it started. And you can go from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, and you can read the street signs, and you can recognize the buildings, and you've got courts and churches and all these things that are recognizable. So there is much less cultural dissension. There's much less cultural difference from someone immigrating throughout the Americas than there is from someone immigrating, let's say, from the Middle East into Europe. It's a culturally coherent zone in one way of looking at it.
Yeah, and I've noticed over time that more and more people I've come into contact with have made that move. As America's become more difficult for, let's say, an aging population, there were a bunch of people moving to Costa Rica, even Nicaragua, Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, all of these places, because they can perceive a cheaper, simpler, but pretty high quality life in many of these countries. I mean, things that, there's good facilities, good services, all of that kind of stuff. So I do think, as you say, maybe there's a cohesion that can grow over time there. And again, that's another realm of opportunity. There may be risk with it, but I think opportunity over time, over a long forgotten reason. I mean, investors don't really care. They got burnt in Brazil and burnt in Argentina yet again.
Right.
And outside of that, they don't really care. So maybe something will happen.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that, that probably people don't understand about Latin America is the way the cultures work down there, which does affect business. And that is that in Latin America, you have a tradition of a patron system, to use.
That's right.
And so you have, and this affects a whole bunch of things, including how we see, corruption as a huge problem in Latin America. There's a lot to say about that. But one of the elements is that, so you have these social pyramids, and the top of it has a patrons, usually male, sometimes female. And that person's job is to get money any way they can. They keep a lot of it for themselves, but they also feed it all the way down to the street sweepers. And so you have this social pyramid that's dependent, is hierarchical, and it's dependent on this person or this small group at the top. And so it is actually seen to be morally defensible or even right for them to do whatever they need to get money to support their whole structure. And so that creates it does several things. It creates a different environment in terms of how government is seen and authority is seen and so forth. But it also means that if you're investing in Latin America, the Latin American economies are pretty much divided among these social pyramids. Some of them are taller, some of them are smaller, but and the smaller ones are not going to grow much more because the taller ones they'll tolerate them, but they'll keep. But if you get in bed with the wrong group, you're simply going to find your growth constrained. And so you really need to understand how the culture works and who's who and who is really untouchably corrupt and who is within the system, but you can work with them and you not violate the laws of your own country and so forth. But mainly just who's in a position of influence and who isn't in these countries. And I think what happens with a lot of Western businessmen is they go over there and they're ignorant of it. They assume that it works like the U.S. or much of Europe, and it doesn't. And so, again, that's where you've got to have an informed view of this sort of thing. But there's a bigger picture here, too, about corruption, and that is that, and Bernard Lewis, a great historian of the Middle East, pointed this out, and he came to a little bit different conclusion than I would come to, but his analysis was that the West is corrupt in the same way that other countries are, but it goes in a completely different direction. So in countries in Latin America and Middle East and so forth, you use political power to get money. That's a common pathway. In the West, you use money to get political power, but it's an equation. They're equivalent. And he thought that the Western way was less damaging. I would argue that it isn't, that they are really equivalent.
I think we're proving that as part of the things we've talked about. Part of the backlash is that Western system is proving to be unacceptable to people.
Yeah.
But Dee, look, fascinating as ever to have a spin around the world and look at this. And I think there's so many things to navigate over time. And I would love to get you back and start navigating and digging into particular situations as and when they develop. And again, to look for the risks, but also to the opportunities, which I think is key in all of this.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dee.
Thank you.